Hello, I'm Billy Stewart, Assistant Pastor here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. Thank you for joining us for the broadcast. I'd like to extend this personal invitation for you to come join us in one of our spirit filled services. Our Sunday school begins at 9 a.m., our Sunday morning worship is at 10 a.m., and our Sunday evening worship is at 6 p.m. We also have an exciting Wednesday evening Bible study that begins at 7 p.m. Come join us, won't you? 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. Hey, we'll save a seat for you. And now, let's join our service already in progress.
Maybe. All right. Are we ready to get started tonight? Very well then. Pastor, why don't you open us up? Amen. All right. Okay. Last week we went over the Ten Commandments. Okay. They were they're there at Mount Sinai and they're supposed to be and they're getting the law. So for the next probably for all of this week and maybe next week and maybe the week after that, y'all are going to law school. Okay? You ready? You're going to law school. We're going to go to law school. All right. We're in Exodus chapter 21. Verse number 1 says, "Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them." This is God talking to Moses, saying, this is the judgments. These are the things that you need to tell the people. As I said, Exodus chapters 21 to 23 contains many of the laws on a wide variety of subjects. So that's why we're going to go to law school in the next couple of weeks. And these include employment law, which is regarding the treatment of the servants, right? Murder, manslaughter, violent assault. Those are all going to be covered in it. Liability for one's animals and responsibility for the animals of others. Also covers theft, responsibility, and restitution. Yes. Murder is premeditated. Okay. Then we talk about theft, responsibility, and restitution. Also talks about rape, dowry, and the value of a woman's restitution. It covers idolatry and sorcery, the treatment of the disadvantaged people in society, and also it even covers money and property lending, and also justice and equal standing before the law. Now, the wide-ranging character of these laws show that God gave them both for the laws themselves and for the principles and precedents that they would establish for the judges that were appointed by Moses. In other words, the laws are for the laws, but they're also for the judges that Moses is going to appoint. And fortunately, they don't have to get Senate confirmation in order to do it, but Moses just appoints them and that's who they are. But they have to have a set of laws in order to go by. Okay? And they're given as precedents to guide Israel's civil magistrates as well in the case of civil disputes. Because remember, there's several portions of the law. There's the moral law, there's the social or criminal law, and then there's the civil law as well. All right, verses 2 to 4. Get started into it. "If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve. and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Okay? Now, in ancient Israel, this, like most everywhere else in the ancient world at the time, there were people who worked for others on the principle of servitude, slavery. But in this case, in the children of Hebrew, the Hebrew children, they were working it as more like indentured servants. They were slaves in some sense, though not necessarily in the brutal and degrading sense that most think of when we think of slavery. You think that the slave is not a person. It's a piece of property. It's a piece of livestock. Okay? Some people actually think that the Bible is responsible for slavery. Okay? You'll get some people that will talk about it, and they said the Bible is responsible for slavery. Okay? That's true. But the Bible being responsible for slavery, actually the opposite is true of that. Slavery existed long before Israel. It existed long before Moses. Okay? But primarily the Bible is actually responsible for the elimination of slavery, not the establishment of it. And it's significant that the first words in this section of the law in the book of Exodus shows that God wanted Israel to respect the rights and the dignity of servants. The first words of God from Sinai declared he was who brought them out of slavery. If you remember when we went in the last chapter, that the first words that God spoke to the children of Israel from Mount Sinai was, I am the God that brought you out of the slavery in Egypt. Okay? And in this remarkable code that he's going to be given, the first person whose rights were dealt with is the slave. Okay? There were 4 basic ways that a Hebrew might become a slave to another Hebrew. Okay? We're not talking about a Hebrew becoming a slave to somebody else. We're talking about a Hebrew becoming a slave to another Hebrew. One of them is in extreme poverty. They might actually sell their liberty. In other words, they're broke. They don't have any money. They don't have any way to sustain themselves. So they will sell their liberty to somebody else. Okay? A father might sell his daughter as a servant. And I'm sure some fathers would really love to sell their daughters nowadays as servants, but they would sell their daughters as servants with the intention that she would eventually marry into the family that she was sold into. Okay? Sometimes it was in the case of bankruptcy. A man might become a servant to his creditors. In other words, you owe money, you can't pay it back, so they say, okay, you'll work for so long as this servant or as a slave for this person to pay off your debt. Okay? And also if a thief had nothing with which to pay proper restitution. So in other words, somebody stole something, he gets caught, he's ordered to pay restitution. It's just like if you're caught nowadays, if you've stolen something from Walmart or just anywhere, or embezzled money, the court's going to make you pay restitution. You have to pay that back. Well, if these people couldn't do it, didn't have the money that they could pay it back, the courts could say, okay, fine. we're going to make you an indentured servant to this person for so many years. You see, not too long ago, in the last few hundred years, used to be they had what they called debtor's prison. That if you couldn't pay your debts, they would throw you in prison until you paid your debts. But you couldn't make any money in prison, so you couldn't pay your debts, so you just stayed in prison. Here, this is something a little bit better, because they're saying, okay, you can't pay your debts. We're not going to put you in prison because you can't pay your debts, but you're going to have to work for somebody else so you can, right? The idea of man-stealing, like they did in Africa to the African slaves, they would steal the people and put them into lifelong servitude. The concept, that's the concept that many people have of slavery, simply did not apply to the practice of slavery in the Old Testament. Normally, a slave was chosen or was mutually arranged with someone else, and it was of a limited duration. It was only for so long. It was highly regulated. In all four of the mentioned cases, the servitude was never obligated to be lifelong. In other words, they couldn't make you a slave forever. There was only a certain amount of time. He was more properly referred to, or we would refer to someone as indentured laborer or indentured servitude. And that period of time, do you remember when in our reading how long that period of time was? 6 years. That's as long as they could do it, was 6 years. Okay? That is nearly the same as in some cases of apprenticeships or even internships today. When you go through an apprenticeship, apprenticeships are 4, 5, 6 years long. Now, you're not indentured servants during that period of time. You're actually getting paid, but you're not getting paid the same amount as the ones who are teaching you on that. Internships. These people that are in college and they go out for their internships, summer internships. Okay? Those people don't get paid. Think about that. They go to these summer internships. They don't get paid for it. The company's getting free labor from them. Okay? And they're doing it to get credits in school to help them go through school. Okay? Now, at the end of the 6 years, when it was over, the servant went out basically with what he came in with. If he came in with nothing, he left with nothing. If he had some clothes and maybe a few personal things, that's what he came in with. That's what he left with. He didn't leave with anything more than what he came in with. He didn't get a certain amount of money when he left. He came in with this, he leaves with this. If the master provided him a wife while he was there, and therefore children, because the wife had children, then the wife and the children had to stay with the master until they had fulfilled their obligation. Okay? So in other words, he might have come in, the slave or the servant may have come in and worked for 3 years, and then the master provides a wife. Well, for 3 years they get married, and for 3 years they're there. But when he gets set free after 6 years, then he has to leave his wife behind because she's still got 3 more years to go. Okay, the same thing with the children. Okay? So they had to stay with the master until they fulfilled their obligations, or they could be redeemed. In other words, he could pay the master to get his wife. Right? All right, verses 5 to 6. If the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I will not go out free. Then the master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. All right? An awl is like a big punch. Okay? So after 6 years of servitude, that servant could say, I want to make a lifelong commitment to this master. I like working with him. I like the guy. He treats me well. Everything's taken care of. I got my wife and kids here with it. I'm just gonna say, hey, I'll be a lifelong servant for you. Okay? And he loves his master in light of the master's goodness and the blessings for the servant. Now, obviously, you're not going to do this to somebody who's treating you bad. So somebody who is willing to go with lifelong indentured servitude to someone is definitely because they've got something that they're treated well. They're being treated good. So, in light of all this, he could go through this ceremony and make a lifelong commitment to his master. Okay? And this commitment was not motivated by debt or obligation. It was motivated only by the love for the master and the good things that the master had provided for the servant. So what would happen is the master would bring the servant to the judges. This describes the public and recognized ceremony for recognizing him as a willing slave and one who had fulfilled his obligations. He was free to go, but he's choosing to stay. He wanted to stay with his master out of love. Now, in the ceremony, the servant had his ear pierced with an awl. Now, an awl, like I said, is a big, it's fairly long. It's pointed at one end, and it kind of expands out a little bit as you go. You use it a lot of times to, he pierced his ears, basically, and marked his ears. Okay? Yeah, kind of like that, something like that, okay? But the awl was people in leather working. They use it to punch holes in the leather. Woodworkers use it some too to punch holes, and that's what it was meant to do. It was meant to punch holes. So the servant says, "I'm going to be your servant forever." They put his ear on this post, on the doorpost, and then they stab him in the ear with that awl. Okay? And they didn't have the alcohol wipes or anything like that, and the little fast, little gun that they use at Claire's or whatever it is to pierce your ears with. Okay? And this was done in the presence of witnesses. When they do this, the judges then change the slave's status from temporary to permanent. Okay? And from then on, he's going to serve the master. He'll serve the master forever. Now, since he's made this commitment, he can't back out on it. It's there. He has to. Once he's made that commitment, that's it. He's there forever. Yeah, if his wife is there, yeah. If his wife is there and he's leaving, but his wife has to stay, he can say, yeah, I want to make this commitment forever. And then, no. He's got to, once he makes that lifelong commitment, it's a lifelong commitment. Can't back out. No backing out of it. All right, verses 7 to 11. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the maidservant, as the men servants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, Then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation he shall have no power, seeing he had dealt deceitfully with her. And if he have betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then she shall go out free without money. So, what this is describing here seems to describe the selling of a young female into a family with the intention that she's going to marry somebody in this family. All right? This is why the text explained, who hath betrothed her to himself. See, in ancient societies, including sometimes among the Hebrews, a child might be sold as a slave in light of a debt. In other words, if you owe money, you'll sell your kids into slavery to pay your debt. Okay? Kid, you better watch out, because they might get a new car and say, hey, I'm in debt, now I'm going to sell you to them to pay off my car. Okay? Yeah, only Riley is available now. Okay? Yeah. But especially in the case of a female slave, in a dowry arrangement to satisfy a debt, such arrangements were more of what we would associate as indentured servitude again, rather than true slavery. Yet, these are not the circumstances for this particular law. If her master did not marry her, in other words, he took her, they sold her so that he would marry her, or decided not to give her to his son, then the master was still obligated to respect her rights under God's law. He had to treat her right, he had to treat her well, and he had to give her the opportunity to escape the obligation of servitude after that period of time was up. Okay? Should the terms of the marriage not be fulfilled, okay, then basically it was considered a breach of contract. And the purchaser, the person who did that, must allow the girl to be redeemed. In other words, bought her, she was supposed to get married, he didn't do it, so the parents or the family of the girl could come back and say, here, I'm giving you your money back, give her here. Or giving you some of the money back for the time that she spent. Okay? So they could still do that. And she couldn't be sold to a foreign people. That was one of their big things. They would not allow you to sell to a foreign person. If you had indentured servitude within the Hebrew people, you had to keep it within the Hebrew people. You couldn't sell them to Egyptians or anyone else. Yeah? And if the girl received into the home with the expectation of future marriage did not work out, she was not to be treated poorly. She was not to be deprived the comforts of the home. Instead, she had to be treated like a daughter, not a slave. Okay? If the household failed in their obligation toward the girl received into the home, with the expectation of the future marriage, in other words, they knew that that's what they were going to do, then she was granted freedom. These were remarkable protections of ones who might be disadvantaged on this. The girl in this circumstance is out of her birth home. She's released by her natural parents to go into indentured servitude. She had no natural protector in that society. So God directed the judges of Israel to be her protector. Okay? So she had rights. All right, verses 12 to 14. He that smiteth a man, so that he die, shall surely be put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hands, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. So the principle for capital punishment goes all the way back to Genesis 9, chapter 6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. So that's the principle or the idea of capital punishment. So it goes all the way back to Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 9. Okay? And the right for the state to use the sword of execution is also stated in Romans 13, 3 and 4. God told the judges of Israel to look for evidence of premeditation and treachery. Okay? In this, God didn't place accidents. It's an accidental death. He didn't place in there crimes of passion. He didn't place in there neglect crimes. He didn't place any of those on the same plane as crimes of premeditation and treachery. Okay? In other words, if you accidentally did it, if you neglectfully did it, things like that, it's covered elsewhere. He didn't look at it, God doesn't look at it the same way as somebody who is premeditated and says, I'm going to go kill that person, okay, for whatever reason. The principle of punishing murderers is so important to God that he denied murderers refuge at his altar. Okay? According to an almost universal custom in the ancient world, a religious altar was a place of sanctuary against justice or vengeance. An accused man might find safety if he could flee to an altar before he was apprehended. See, we still have something like that even today. Not so much in Protestant churches, although there are some that will do it. But otherwise, there are places that the church is called, a person can come into a church and claim sanctuary. So I am claiming sanctuary, which means that the clergy, the people in the church, cannot turn them over to an authority, to the police or anything like that, because that person claimed sanctuary in the church. And that's basically the same thing that was going on here. If they can make it to an altar, if they can make it to a place like that, then they could possibly escape that punishment or vengeance. But God's saying in this case, in the case of murder, that doesn't work. Even if you're at the altar, in a case of murder, you're still going. It's still going to happen. Okay? So God told the judges of Israel there was to be no mercy in sentencing of those guilty of the worst murders. What we might call today first-degree murder, capital murder, something like that. Those people, those murderers, were to find no protection whatsoever. Okay? In misunderstood and misapplied faith, God says that unpunished murderers defiled the land in Numbers 35, 31, and 33, 34. Okay? God said that these people, these unpunished murderers who had misunderstood or misapplied faith by trying to go to the altars, they defiled the land in Numbers. The principle that unpunished murderers defile the land is pretty sobering when you think about it. And it's humbling. It's a humbling thought among Americans as well. When you think about it, there are so many murders in this country, and very few of them are ever brought to justice for those murders. Now, later in Numbers 35 and in Joshua 20, God commanded and Israel made cities of refuge. These were selected, prepared city where one could flee in cases of manslaughter, things like that. And they would be protected there until his case could be properly heard. So in other words, they could go and stay out of, they were kind of like penal cities, I guess you could say. They could go there and they could be safe until, from vengeance of somebody else, until they had the chance to be heard. This careful distinction between the degrees of guilt in murder and the protections for the one guilty of manslaughter as opposed to murder shows the sophistication and the concern for justice in the principles given to Israelite judges. So in other words, God is making a very clear distinction here. Manslaughter is one thing, but murder, premeditated, treacherous murder, that's it. That's the worst thing you can do. Okay? Now, manslaughter, accidental, those type of things, so they've got different sets of laws for those. All right, verses 15 to 17. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Lot of capital crimes there. Okay? Yeah, all of them are given the death penalty here. Smite, we can take this in the context of Exodus 21:12, where it's actually hitting somebody or putting somebody down that way. A child who murdered or attempts to murder of a parent was to receive capital punishment. Okay? Kidnapping was also considered a capital offense in the eyes of God. Criminally enslaving a man was not far from murdering him in the eyes of God. Okay? Now, there is a subtle yet important difference between slavery as it was and is, in our eyes, commonly practiced, and slavery as regulated in the Bible. Most slavery, other than what we see here, most slavery was actually a form of kidnapping. The slavery that this country experienced was actually a form of kidnapping. A person was stolen from another country and brought here. All right? The taking and imprisoning of a person against their will in ancient Israel. Other cultures were not kidnapped and enslaved. The idea in verse 17 was of an adult child who threatened their parents. Right? Now, think about that. Even bad-mouthing their, back-talking your parents, they could kill you for it. Though this law was severe, it preserved a critical foundation for civilized society, and that is respect between generations. According to Deuteronomy 21:18 to 21, the parent did not have the right to carry out this punishment. In other words, if the kids badmouth you, you couldn't go kill them. They were required to bring the accused child before the elders and judges of the city. This meant that the parent against all contemporary custom, did not have absolute power of the life and death over their children. And as a practical matter, the judges of Israel rarely, if ever, administered the death penalty in such cases. In other words, just bad-mouthing your parents, they probably weren't going to kill you, although they could. Right? But the child was held accountable for what they did. Right? They didn't have to take their life, but they were held accountable. Yeah, there's no accountability in the world today. Right? That's right. Verses 18 and 19. And if men strive together, and one smite another with a stone, or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. So, what that's saying is, if because of some sort of conflict, they get into a fight, whatever reason, and a man was unable to work because of an injury at the hand of another, the one who injured him had to pay compensation to the man and his family. But if a man could recover from the injury, the guilty party was only required to pay for his medical recovery and for his lost time. Okay? So what that's saying is that if they get into a fight and he disables somebody to where they can't work, that person's got to take care of him and his family from now on. But if they get into a fight, he beats him up, and he gets better, well, then he's only got to pay for his medical bills and the lost time that he had while he was injured. Right? These principles have been abused in the world today. Right? That's why we have so many frivolous lawsuits out there. Right? People can sue somebody for anything. And we're a sue-happy society. People would just sue. Okay? We were talking, I think last week or Sunday sometime, not too long ago, we were talking about all these people who who've been suing places like McDonald's for getting hot coffee and they spill it on them and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. They would have been suing for that. Well, yeah. And you dropping it on yourself. Yeah. But they dropped it on themselves. As you can get. And there is right now in Georgia, I don't know how many of you have seen this or not, but the family of 3 teenagers are suing a man because these 3 teenagers came in, tried to break into his house, was kicking down his door at 4 in the morning, fired a gun at him, and this guy popped some rounds through the door and killed all 3 of those that were there. The family is suing the guy that killed them. But according to Georgia law, the castle doctrine and the stand your ground doctrine in Georgia, the prosecutors have already said, we're not going to prosecute the guy. He was well within his rights. But the family is still going to sue him. Yeah. Well, you'd be surprised. There was, when I was in law enforcement years ago, back in the 90s, they had a high-speed pursuit in Fayetteville. Guy was drunk. They got him behind him. He refused to stop, got in a high-speed pursuit. The guy got into a wreck, ran off the road, got into a wreck, and got killed. The family of that guy sued the police department and said if the police department had not chased him, he wouldn't have gotten to a wreck and he wouldn't have died. And they won. They won. The police department had to pay. So the police department changed their policy. They said from now on, if you get a license plate number, we're calling off the pursuit. So that's what they did. They got another guy. Get in behind him, start to try to pull him over, he takes off. They got a license plate number, called off the pursuit. They stopped because they had the guy's license plate number. The guy drove down the road about 5-10 miles, got into a wreck, and was killed. The family of that guy sued the police department and said if the police would have kept chasing him and made him stop, then he wouldn't have got killed. And they won. So it was a no-win situation, you know. Either way you go, you're going to lose. Well, technically, yes. Are they going to win? Who knows? But they can. Okay? There was, when I was living in Texas, there was a guy that broke into a church by chopping a hole in the roof, in the ceiling, the roof of the church. He chopped a hole, he dropped a rope down, and was sliding down this rope to steal a bunch of stuff. Okay? As he was sliding down the rope, the guy wasn't real bright. The rope broke because he wasn't using a good rope, and the rope broke. He fell across a pew, broke his back. The family of the person that broke his back sued the church because he broke his back. Their defense was, they said, but he was breaking into, they said, well, that doesn't matter. He can't work anymore. He was a thief. Doesn't matter what his profession was. He can no longer do his profession. He can no longer make money with his profession. So we're going to sue. And they won. This is the how frivolous the frivolity of lawsuits have gotten, and how the courts, fortunately, they are. I think Arkansas is now has now passed laws to where they have, if you keep maliciously, it's called malicious tort or frivolous tort, where you keep suing somebody and somebody keeps suing somebody over and over and over again. They finally say, look, no, we're not going to let you sue anybody anymore for anything. Because there's people that will go out and slam on the brakes in front of you going down the road. You rear end. Usually if it's a rear end accident, the person behind is always responsible, is always at fault. And that's why a lot of people have got those dash mounted cameras now to where they show that. Okay? And backed into her, yeah. 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 And they got out. I think I saw that when they got out and they started acting like, oh, I'm hurt. And then they look up and they see the camera on her dash and they go, oh, let's go. Let's get out of here. Yeah. People will. Yeah. 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 And then pull right in front of you and slam on their brakes and brake check you, yeah. All right, let's move on real quick while we still got time here. Verses 20 and 21, and if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. So this shows that in ancient Israel, servants could be murdered. In other cultures, the master was held blameless if he murdered a servant, okay? Because the servant was not considered a person. It was considered livestock. Yet the master could not be punished if the servant did not die immediately. If he hit him and he dies, then he can be punished. If he hit him but he lives, well, then he couldn't be punished. So perhaps this was a way to determine intent, with the idea that if the servant lived for several days, it was an indication that the master must not have intended to murder him. The idea was that if the victim did not die immediately, it was evidence that he was struck with the intention of discipline rather than murder. All right? Additionally, if the slave died through his unintentional attack, the loss of property was thought to be penalty enough to the master. So this reflects a great principle in the law of Moses, great consideration to the rights of the accused. These laws altogether paint a picture of the ideas behind slavery in ancient Israel. A servant was a person, yet they were also considered property until their obligation was fulfilled. When it says that for he is his money, the point is that men are mere chattel for that part. When they're indentured, they're worth something. They're like livestock, okay? But that the owner has an investment in his slave, which he does. He's fed him, he's, housed him, he's done all these other things for him. Okay? That he stands to either lose either by death or by emancipation. These principles paint a spiritual analogy. Spiritually speaking, we are the property of who we serve. Okay? We either are slaves to Satan or we're slaves to Jesus. Okay? All right, verses 22 to 25. If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished according as to the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This is an example of a case of retribution. When a pregnant woman was injured in a conflict and she gave birth prematurely, the penalty was only assessed if there was lasting damage. If no lasting damage resulted, there were no damages awarded. Perhaps this was recognition that the law cannot address every loss or consequences, and that only permanent consequences are justly compensated. If lasting damage resulted, short of death, they didn't die, which was covered by another law, the law of murder, okay, then there was retribution or restitution due. If lasting damage resulted, then the eye for an eye principle was invoked. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Okay? But this principle was always limited retribution. Okay? In other words, you can only do as much to them as they did to the other person. You can't do more. This law was meant to block man's natural desire for vengeance. And we had that. Okay? Man has that natural desire that if somebody does something to us, we want to hurt them worse than what they hurt us. But this law is not allowing that to happen. This law is saying you can only do to that person what that person did to you. It was not given as a license for revenge. Okay? Said, we want to do more to the offending party than they did to us. This principle can apply to our modern practice of assessing huge punitive damages in lawsuits. Okay? In other words, they'll give punitive damages that are ridiculous, that are nowhere near what the person actually went through. Okay? And this law presents the principle that only the loss itself is to be compensated. Basically, what that do in today's law is that if somebody negligently hits you and you get into a wreck with them, and you have to spend 3 days, 4 days in the hospital, and then you lose 6 weeks worth of work, okay, you should pay for the hospital bills and the 6 weeks that person lost wages. But nowadays they sue the insurance companies for millions and millions of dollars. And then that's why we got so many of these personal injury lawyers out there, because they do that. Oh, our insurance is so high. Then thou shalt give life for life. This principle leads some to wonder if in ancient Israel people were routinely killed for what we might consider accidental death or even manslaughter. But it's important to correlate this with the principle of shall give life for life with Numbers 35:31, which allows substitute ransom payment for the loss of life that was not willful or premeditated murder. All right? Moving on. And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. So this is the principle of an eye for an eye. Had a different application here for the servants. Instead of if the master injured somebody by knocking their eye out, instead of them taking their eye out, the servant received something more precious than the eye, his freedom. So if he did something that caused him damage, to lose an eye, a tooth, something like that, then he was set free. His obligation was then over. Okay? These laws don't try to make the master feel a certain way about his slave. Instead, what these laws are doing is guiding the behavior of the master, giving him an incentive to protect and to honor his slave, treating them more like employees than work animals. All right, we're finishing up here. If an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit. But if the ox were wont to push with his horns in times past, and it hath been testified to his owner, and he hath not kept him in, but that he hath killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owners also shall be put to death. If there be laid on him a sum of money, that he shall give for ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. Whether he have gore a son, or have gored a daughter, according to this judgment shall it be done unto him. If the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall be given unto the master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Okay? This law here illustrates the principle of intent and neglect. If you owned a man-killing ox, you couldn't be held guilty if the animal had no history of aggression towards anyone else. Okay. If the ox had, yeah, if the ox had never done anything to anybody and it was there, okay, then the owner wasn't going to be held responsible for it. But the animal was still going to die. No. The owner was, because the owner was forbidden to profit from the animal or its death. Okay? No one was to profit from it, or even casually regard even an accidental death. And here's what it says: but if the ox were wont to push with his horn in times past, and it hath been testified to his owner, he hath not kept him in, and he hath not kept him in. So if the ox owner had an ox who he knew to be aggressive and failed to control the animal, then he was guilty of murder, and he was put to death as well. Okay? It seems that if the survivors of the dead man accepted monetary restitution instead, in lieu of the owner's death, in other words, the owner said, hey man, I'll give you so much money. Yeah, if the survivors of the person that got killed said, yeah, okay, we'll accept that instead of your death, then that's fine. He could do that. He could buy his way out of it. Okay? Okay. Yeah, but basically what they're saying is that you knew this was an aggressive animal. You knew that it was going to do, it could do something like this, and you let it do it anyway. Okay? So that being the case, that's the same as murder. Okay? But like I said, if they accepted money in lieu of the owner's death, then this was an acceptable settlement. The same principles were applied in the death of a minor. They were regarded as people with rights to respect as well as the adults were. If a servant was killed under such circumstances, okay, the price of restitution to the owner of the slave, the servant, was 30 shekels of silver. Well, how much is 30 shekels of silver, you might ask? It's a wonderful question. Let me tell you. The modern equivalent would be about $27,500. Well, I mean, back then it was 30 pieces of shekel would buy several acres of land. It was a lot of money. $27,000 is a lot of money today. But that $27,500, that 30 pieces of shekel, 30 shekels of silver, was considered the price of a slave. Okay. All right. Last one. We're almost done here. And if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein, the owner of the pit shall make it good and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. And if the man's ox hurt another's that he die, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it, and the dead ox also they shall divide. Or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in times past, and the owner hath not kept him in, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead shall be his own. So this law communicates the principle of responsibility and consequences of an individual's actions upon another. The example given here had to do with the necessary restitution. When digging a pit, and it caused the death of an animal. Now, most of the time, digging of a pit was used to store grain or to set a trap or things like that. Okay? If it caused death to an animal, if one man's ox hurt another's, that he die, these laws required the investigation and analysis of the judges, so that the application of law took into account finding the intent and the negligence. There is a sense in these are simply applications of the general principles of justice and fairness. Okay? And that finishes the first part of our law training. Okay? It's kind of interesting when you look at it and see what all the law, when the law is there, and what it means. Any questions, comments, concerns, amens, oh me?
Thank you for joining us today. We pray you were blessed by the broadcast. If you have a prayer request or questions about Solid Rock Tabernacle, please visit our website at www.solidrocktabernacle.org. That's www.solidrocktabernacle.org. On behalf of the pastors and congregation here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, we pray you have a blessed week, and we invite you to join us in person or on one of our future broadcasts.